The bitter Montana wind howled above, a relentless force burying the log cabin in 6 feet of packed snow. But Beatrice Gallagher didn't care. She had her secret. A 150-foot subterranean corrugated steel tunnel connecting her cellar directly to the livestock barn. It was her ultimate defiance against the winter that had claimed her husband's life 3 years prior. For 3 weeks of the historic blizzard, the tunnel was her sanctuary, her safe and silent passage beneath the lethal frost. Until the morning she walked halfway down the dimly lit corridor and found a wet, muddy boot print tracking in the opposite direction. The snow had sealed her in, but she wasn't alone. The Bitterroot Valley in western Montana is a place of uncompromising beauty and merciless extremes. For Beatrice B. Gallagher, a 58-year-old retired high school English teacher, the valley was both her heaven and her purgatory. Her purgatory began on a Tuesday in late January, 3 years ago, when the sky turned the color of bruised iron and the temperature plummeted 40 degrees in a matter of hours. Her husband, Thomas, had gone out to the barn to check on their flock of heritage Icelandic sheep. The barn was only 50 yards from the cabin's back porch, but in a true Montana whiteout, 50 yards might as well be 50 miles. The wind had whipped the snow into a blinding, suffocating frenzy. Thomas lost his bearings. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, Beatrice and Sheriff Boyd Higgins found him. He was frozen solid, slumped against the exterior wall of the barn, less than 10 feet from the heavy sliding door. Inside his heavy Carhartt coat, pressed against his chest, was a newborn lamb. The lamb had survived. Thomas had not. The tragedy fractured Beatrice's world. Her daughter, Chloe, a corporate lawyer living in Seattle, pleaded with her to sell the property. "Mom, it's a death trap out there. Dad died for a sheep. Please, come to the city." But Beatrice possessed a stubborn streak forged in the mountain bedrock. She refused to leave the home she and Thomas had built. She refused to sell the flock. Instead, she developed an obsession. If the surface of the earth was going to turn into a frozen hell every winter, she would simply remove the surface from the equation. She would build a tunnel. When Beatrice presented the blueprints to Arthur Pendleton, a local excavation contractor known for his gruff demeanor and exceptional backhoe skills, he laughed out loud. He sat at Beatrice's kitchen table, his massive, calloused hands resting on the rolled-up schematics. "With all due respect, you're out of your mind," Arthur said, adjusting his faded baseball cap. "You're talking about 150 feet of trenching, at least 10 feet deep to get below the frost line. You need commercial-grade corrugated high-density polyethylene, the stuff they use for highway culverts. You need grading, drainage, concrete footings for the access points. This isn't a root cellar. You're building a horizontal grave." "I am building a bridge, Arthur," Beatrice replied, her voice eerily calm, her eyes fixed on the snow-capped peaks visible through the kitchen window. "I remortgaged this cabin yesterday. I have the funds. If you won't dig it, I will drive to Missoula and find a crew who will. But I want you, because Thomas trusted you," Arthur sighed, recognizing the immovable force of a grieving widow's determination. "It's going to cost you $80,000, B, and if the county finds out you're doing this without commercial permits, they'll fine you into oblivion." "Then we don't tell the county," Beatrice said. Construction began in late July, under the brutal, dry heat of the Montana summer. The noise was deafening. Arthur brought in a massive Caterpillar excavator, its iron teeth tearing into the earth between the cabin and the barn. Beatrice watched from the porch, drinking iced tea, feeling a strange, vindictive satisfaction as the deep scar was carved into the land that had killed her husband. It was grueling work. The Bitterroot soil was heavily laced with glacial till and granite boulders. Twice, Arthur's bucket slammed into rocks the size of compact cars, requiring days of tedious jackhammering to clear the path. But piece by piece, the tunnel took shape. They used 8-foot diameter double-wall corrugated steel pipes, coated in heavy asphalt to prevent rusting. Each 20-foot section was lowered into the deep trench by a crane, then meticulously welded and bolted to the next. The interior was vast, easily large enough for Beatrice to walk through upright with a bale of hay in her arms. To connect it to the cabin, Arthur knocked a massive hole through the foundation of Beatrice's stone basement, installing a heavy, fireproof steel door. At the barn end, the tunnel sloped gently upward, emerging beneath a reinforced wooden trapdoor situated perfectly inside the insulated feed room. By September, the pipeline was laid. Arthur installed French drains along the exterior to prevent groundwater accumulation and layered thousands of pounds of gravel over the steel before burying it in topsoil. From the surface, once the grass seed was thrown down, there was absolutely no evidence that a massive subterranean artery connected the two structures. Beatrice had her passage, but she had no idea what she had invited into the earth. October brought the first bitter kiss of autumn, stripping the cottonwood trees of their leaves and turning the valley floor a brittle, pale brown. With Arthur and his heavy machinery gone, a profound, heavy silence reclaimed the Gallagher property. Beatrice spent the first few weeks of October finishing the interior of the tunnel herself. She ran a heavy-duty electrical conduit along the ceiling, installing a string of caged LED shop lights every 15 feet. When she flipped the switch in the cellar, the tunnel illuminated with a stark, clinical brightness, the ribbed steel walls stretching out in a mesmerizing, almost hypnotic vanishing point. The atmosphere inside was entirely alien. Because it was buried 10 feet underground, the ambient temperature hovered naturally around 50 degrees, regardless of the freezing air above. It smelled of raw earth, curing caulk, and the faint, metallic tang of the steel. But the most unsettling aspect of the tunnel was its acoustics. It was a perfect echo chamber. A single cough would bounce down the corrugated ridges, amplifying and distorting until it sounded like a chorus of raspy whispers at the far end. The scrape of her rubber boots on the flat, poured concrete floor of the pipe sounded like a slow drumbeat. Beatrice's daily routine shifted dramatically. When the first heavy snowfalls arrived in November, laying a thick, white blanket over the bitterroots, Beatrice didn't bother putting on her heavy parka, her snow pants, or her goggles to feed the sheep. Instead, at 6 a.m., wearing just her jeans, a light sweater, and her rubber boots, she would descend the wooden stairs into the cellar. She would unbolt the heavy steel door, step into the bright, echoing tube, and walk the 150 feet to the barn. She'd climb the wooden stairs at the end, push open the trapdoor, and emerge directly into the feed room. The Icelandic sheep, with their thick, woolly coats, would bleat in greeting. She would toss them their alfalfa, check their water troughs, and walk back. It was a triumph. It was a marvel. It was a middle finger to nature. However, the psychological toll of the tunnel began to manifest subtly. It felt like walking through the belly of a mechanical beast. The absolute absence of natural light, the deadened air, and the creeping isolation of the valley began to distort Beatrice's sense of time and space. On Thanksgiving Day, Chloe called. Beatrice sat in her living room, watching a moderate snowstorm bury the county road at the end of her driveway. "Mom, I'm looking at the weather radar for your area," Chloe said, her voice crackling slightly over the rural telephone line. "They are predicting a massive system moving in next week. A La Niña event. Please, just pack a bag and drive to Missoula. Stay in a hotel. You can't be out there alone." "I am perfectly fine, Chloe," Beatrice said, taking a sip of black coffee. "The pantry is stocked for 6 months. The generator has 200 gallons of diesel, and I have the tunnel." Chloe let out a long, frustrated sigh. "That tunnel. Mom, it's not healthy. You're living like a mole. You buried yourself in the ground before you even died. Arthur told me what it looks like down there. It's creepy." "Arthur talks too much," Beatrice snapped. "Arthur didn't watch your father freeze to death 20 yards from a warm fireplace. The tunnel is practical. It's safe. Just be careful, Mom. Promise me you'll keep your cell phone charged." "I promise. I love you, Chloe." "Love you too, Mom." Beatrice hung up. She looked out the window. The snow was falling faster now, thick and heavy, erasing the horizon. She felt a strange urge to check on the sheep, even though she had just fed them an hour ago. She walked down to the cellar, opened the heavy steel door, and stepped into the artificial glare of the tunnel. As she walked, she paused halfway. She stood perfectly still, holding her breath. Drip, drip, drip. It was just condensation. Water from the unfrozen earth outside, weeping through a microscopic gap in the welding, pooling on the concrete floor. But in the dead silence of the subterranean tube, the dripping sounded like footsteps. Beatrice shook her head, annoyed at her own sudden paranoia, and continued to the barn. The winter had just begun, and the tunnel was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. She was completely isolated, perfectly secure, and utterly alone, or so she thought. The meteorologists called it the storm of the decade. By the second week of December, a colossal low-pressure system stalled directly over the Bitterroot Range, drawing in Arctic air from Canada and moisture from the Pacific. It started on a Tuesday night. By Thursday morning, 70 inches of snow had fallen on Beatrice's property. The wind howled at sustained speeds of 60 miles per hour, creating snowdrifts that swallowed the first story of the cabin. The windows were entirely blocked by solid walls of white. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the roaring, violent sound of the wind tearing at the log walls. Sheriff Boyd Higgins had managed to get a radio broadcast out to the remote residents on Wednesday afternoon before the main transmitter tower on Mount Ward collapsed under the ice. Do not attempt to travel. Emergency services cannot reach you. Hunker down, conserve fuel, and wait it out. May God be with you. Inside the cabin, Beatrice felt a smug sense of security. The wood stove was roaring, casting a warm, orange glow across the living room. Her electricity was still on, though the lights flickered occasionally as the power lines miles away strained under the ice. On Friday, day 4 of the blizzard, the routine continued. At 7 a.m., Beatrice went down to the cellar, opened the tunnel door, and walked to the barn. The contrast between the surface and the tunnel was starker than ever. Above, it was a lethal, chaotic, frozen hurricane. Below, in the tunnel, it was perfectly still, illuminated by the humming LED lights. When she pushed open the trapdoor in the barn's feed room, the air was freezing. The barn was unheated, relying only on the body heat of the 30 sheep to keep it above zero. The sheep were huddled together in the main pen, chewing their cud, seemingly unbothered by the apocalypse raging against the barn's exterior walls. Beatrice grabbed a pitchfork and began distributing hay. As she worked, a subtle prickle of unease washed over her. She stopped and looked around the feed room. Something was wrong. It was a minor detail, something only someone who lived a life of rigid routine would notice. The heavy pair of leather work gloves she always left resting on the lid of the grain bin were gone. She looked on the floor. Not there. She checked the shelves. Nothing. I probably took them back to the cabin, she rationalized, though she knew she never wore those gloves inside the house. They smelled like lanolin and manure. She finished her chores, climbed back down the trapdoor, bolted it from the bottom, and walked the 150 feet back to the cellar. She checked the cabin. The gloves were nowhere to be found. She dismissed it as the absent-mindedness of isolation. Cabin fever playing tricks on her memory. On day 6 of the blizzard, the inevitable happened. At 4:30 p.m., just as the sky outside, wherever the sky was turning to pitch black. The power grid failed completely. The cabin plunged into darkness. A moment later, the deafening thump roar of the standby diesel generator kicked in from its shed attached to the side of the house. The lights in the cabin flickered back to life, but the tunnel was on a different sub-panel. One Beatrice had forgotten to wire to the backup generator. The next morning, when Beatrice went down to the cellar to feed the sheep, she opened the heavy steel door and was met with an impenetrable wall of blackness. The LED shop lights were dead. The 150-foot tube stretched out before her like the throat of a massive, lightless beast. She swallowed hard, her heart thumping against her ribs. She went back upstairs, grabbed her heavy-duty maglite, a thick, aluminum flashlight that weighed 3 pounds, and cast a beam bright enough to blind a bear, and returned to the cellar. She clicked the flashlight on. The harsh, white beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the corrugated ridges of the tunnel. Dust motes danced in the light. Because the power was out, the ambient heat of the lights was gone, and the temperature in the tunnel had noticeably dropped. Her breath plumed in front of her in thick, white clouds. She stepped in. The silence was heavier now, without the low electrical hum. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Her boots echoed endlessly. She reached the barn, climbed the stairs in the dark, and pushed open the trapdoor. The barn was dimly lit by the gray, bruised light filtering through the snow-packed windows. She fed the sheep, her nerves on edge. She felt watched. Every shadow thrown by the flashlight seemed to move. She hurried through her chores, eager to get back to the warmth and safety of the cabin. As she returned to the feed room to lower herself back into the trapdoor, the beam of her maglite swept across the floor behind the grain bin. Beatrice froze. The blood drained from her face, her stomach free-falling into a cold void. Resting on a discarded burlap sack, tucked neatly into the corner, was a silver tin. Beatrice slowly walked over to it, her hand trembling as she held the flashlight. It was a tin of baked beans. The metal lid had been peeled back roughly, likely with a hunting knife. The tin was half empty. Beside it lay a spoon. Beatrice didn't eat canned baked beans. She hadn't bought a can in 10 years. She backed away slowly, her breath catching in her throat. She swept the flashlight wildly around the feed room, into the rafters, over the hay bales. Nothing. Just the wind screaming outside. Panic setting in. She practically threw herself down the trapdoor, pulling it shut above her with a loud bang. She threw the deadbolt, locking the barn access tight. She turned and began to sprint down the pitch-black tunnel toward her cabin, the beam of the flashlight bouncing wildly off the steel walls. 100 feet, 50 feet, 20 feet. She reached the cellar door. She grabbed the handle and yanked. It didn't move. She pulled harder, dropping the flashlight to grab the heavy iron handle with both hands. It was locked, but not from her side. The heavy steel deadbolt on the inside of her cellar, inside her home, had been thrown shut while she was in the barn. Beatrice stood in the freezing, pitch-black tunnel, the dropped flashlight rolling on the concrete floor, pointing back toward the barn. And from the darkness at the far end of the tunnel, right where she had just locked the trapdoor, she heard the distinct, heavy sound of a man coughing. The maglite hit the poured concrete floor with a harsh, metallic clatter, rolling wildly on its heavy cylindrical barrel. The brilliant white beam swept dizzying arcs across the corrugated steel walls, casting long, grotesque shadows before finally coming to rest, pointing directly at the barn end of the tunnel. Beatrice Gallagher did not scream. The paralyzing, icy grip of terror in her chest squeezed the air from her lungs. But her survival instinct, sharpened by decades of brutal Montana winters, kicked in. She dropped to her knees, her hands scrambling blindly over the cold concrete. Her fingers brushed the knurled aluminum of the flashlight. She didn't pick it up to wield it. She thumbed the heavy rubber switch. Click. The tunnel plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. Beatrice pressed her back against the freezing steel of her locked cellar door, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She strained her ears, breathing in shallow, silent gasps through her nose. The darkness was so complete it felt like a physical weight pressing against her eyeballs. For 30 agonizing seconds, the only sound was the distant, muffled roar of the blizzard raging 10 feet above her head. Then, the scraping of a boot against concrete. It was faint, but in the echoing chamber of the subterranean pipe, it sounded like a gunshot. Smart, a voice rasped from the pitch black. It was a man's voice, rough and thick with phlegm. The acoustics of the tunnel distorted the words, layering them with a dozen hissing echoes that made it impossible to pinpoint exactly how far away he was. Turning off the light. That was real smart, Mrs. Gallagher. Beatrice pressed her palms flat against the heavy iron door behind her. She had lived in the Bitterroot Valley for 35 years. She knew her neighbors, she knew the townspeople, and she knew the transient workers who drifted through during the harvest and construction seasons. The voice was familiar, carrying the distinct, nasal drawl of the local meth country outliers. "Who are you?" Beatrice demanded. She was shocked by the steadiness of her own voice. It didn't tremble. It carried down the steel tube with the authoritative bark of the high school English teacher she used to be. A low, wet chuckle bounced off the walls. "You don't remember me, B? I spent 3 weeks baking in the July sun, hauling gravel for that tight-ass Arthur Pendleton just so you could have your little secret highway. My name's Wyatt. Wyatt Dixon." The memory slammed into her. Wyatt Dixon. A wiry, twitchy man in his early 30s with bad teeth and a faded scorpion tattoo on his neck. Arthur had fired him halfway through the tunnel project for showing up to the site smelling of cheap whiskey and nodding off in the cab of the skid steer. "What are you doing in my home, Wyatt?" Beatrice asked, her mind racing. She remembered the half-eaten tin of beans. "He hasn't just broken in. He's been living down here, trying not to freeze to death, mostly," Wyatt said. The sound of his boots scraped again. He was moving closer. "Me and my brother, Caleb, we were heading down to Idaho in his F-250 when the storm hit Tuesday. Truck went off the embankment into the Clark Fork riverbed. We walked 4 miles in that whiteout. Caleb almost lost his toes. But I remembered. I remembered the rich widow and her secret underground bunker. "So you broke into my barn," Beatrice said, her hand sliding slowly along the wall in the dark. "Searching for something. Anything." "I popped the window in the tack room," Wyatt confirmed. The echoes made his voice sound like it was swirling around her head. "Found the trap door. It's been real cozy down here. Better than freezing. But Caleb got greedy. He didn't want to sleep in the dirt with the sheep. Last night, while the wind was howling, he jimmied the latch on your kitchen window. Slipped right in. Said you were asleep in your chair by the fire. He's been in your guest room all night, eating your pantry dry." A wave of profound violation washed over Beatrice. For a day and a half, these men had been crawling through her property, inches away from her, watching her. "If Caleb is in the house," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "why did he lock me out?" "Because we don't need you anymore, B," Wyatt said. He coughed again, a deep, rattling hack. "Power's out. Caleb locked the cellar door so I could deal with you down here. No witnesses. We take the truck keys. We take the generator. We wait out the storm. And we vanish. Now, turn the flashlight back on and make this easy. I've got a hunting knife that's 6 inches long, and I can hear you breathing." Beatrice's hand, sweeping frantically along the base of the concrete footing near the door, brushed against something cold, hard, and cylindrical. It was the spud bar, a 5-foot-long, 30-pound solid iron digging bar with a chisel tip. Arthur had used it to chip away bedrock during the excavation, and Beatrice had dragged it down to the cellar months ago to chip away some ice buildup near the doorframe. She had left it leaning in the corner. She wrapped both hands around the freezing iron. It was incredibly heavy, but a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline fueled her muscles. She didn't lift it, she just held it tight, resting the tip on the ground. "You're right, Wyatt," Beatrice called out, projecting her voice toward the ceiling to confuse the echo. "I'm right here." She picked up the maglite with her left hand. She tossed it 10 feet to her right, sending it skittering across the concrete floor. As it hit the ground, it clicked on. The blinding white beam illuminated the tunnel, pointing uselessly at the curved steel wall. But the ambient glare was enough to reveal Wyatt Dixon. He was only 20 feet away, creeping forward in a crouch, a massive, serrated hunting knife gripped in his right hand. He was filthy, wearing a heavy, snow-crusted Carhartt jacket. Wyatt flinched, his eyes darting toward the flashlight on the floor. It was a fatal, momentary distraction. Beatrice stepped forward, driving her body weight into the movement. She swung the 30-pound iron spud bar like a baseball bat, aiming low. The heavy iron connected with Wyatt's left knee with a sickening, wet crack that echoed violently through the tunnel. Wyatt screamed a high-pitched, agonizing wail and collapsed, dropping the knife as his leg buckled beneath him. He hit the concrete hard, clutching his shattered knee, writhing in the dim, splashed light of the maglite. Beatrice didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, picked up the flashlight, and shined the blinding beam directly into his tear-streaked face. She planted the chisel tip of the heavy iron bar squarely against his sternum, pressing down just enough to restrict his breathing. "You made a mistake, Wyatt," Beatrice hissed, her breath pluming in the freezing air. "I didn't build this tunnel to hide. I built it to survive. And you are trespassing." Wyatt sobbed, a pathetic, wet sound that reverberated off the steel. The bravado he had projected in the darkness was entirely gone, replaced by the sheer, blinding agony of a shattered patella. "Please, he gasped, his hands hovering frantically around the heavy iron bar pressing into his chest, afraid to touch it. "Please, God, my leg. I need a doctor." "There are no doctors," Beatrice said coldly, keeping the pressure steady. "The roads are buried under 6 feet of snow. Emergency services are paralyzed. You and your brother chose to come here." Beatrice evaluated her situation. She was trapped in a freezing, unlit subterranean pipe with a crippled intruder. The steel door to her warm, well-stocked cabin was locked from the inside by Caleb Dixon, a desperate man who likely assumed his brother had already murdered her. She couldn't stay in the tunnel. Without the ambient heat from the shop lights, the temperature was dropping rapidly, creeping toward freezing. She kicked Wyatt's dropped hunting knife down the tunnel, out of his reach. "Get up," she commanded. "I can't!" Wyatt wailed, his face pale and glistening with cold sweat in the flashlight's beam. "My knee is crushed, lady. I can't walk." "Then you will crawl," Beatrice said, stepping back and hefting the iron bar onto her shoulder. "You are going back to the barn. Move." It took them 20 minutes to traverse the remaining 130 feet of the tunnel. Wyatt dragged himself backward on his hands and his good leg, leaving a smeared trail of dirt and blood on the pristine concrete. Beatrice followed 2 paces behind, the beam of her flashlight fixed on him, her grip on the iron bar unyielding. When they reached the wooden stairs leading to the trapdoor, Wyatt collapsed, exhausted and shivering violently. Beatrice forced him up the steps at knife point, having retrieved his weapon from the floor, and pushed him through the trapdoor into the feed room. The barn was bitterly cold, the air thick with the smell of lanolin, damp hay, and manure. The gray, bruised light of late morning filtered through the frost-heaved windows. Outside, the blizzard howled with unabated fury, shaking the heavy timber frame of the structure. The 30 Icelandic sheep milled nervously in their pens, unsettled by the intrusion. Beatrice found a coil of heavy nylon rope she used for haltering rams. With ruthless efficiency, she bound Wyatt's wrists tightly behind his back, then tied the other end of the rope securely to a heavy, bolted support beam in the center of the feed room. He slumped against the wood, shivering, his injured legs stretched out awkwardly in front of him. Beatrice paced the feed room, wrapping her arms around herself to preserve her body heat. She was wearing only jeans and a light wool sweater. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the brutal reality of the cold was sinking into her bones. If she stayed in the barn, she would freeze to death by nightfall. "What's your brother's plan?" Beatrice asked, stopping in front of Wyatt. Wyatt spat a glob of bloody phlegm onto the hay-strewn floor. "Screw you. Caleb's gonna realize I'm gone. He's gonna come looking." "Is he?" Beatrice asked, her mind working furiously. "Caleb locked the door to trap me. He thinks you killed me. He's sitting by my fire, eating my food. Why would he come out into the freezing tunnel before the storm breaks?" Wyatt blinked, the realization slowly dawning on his pained features. Caleb was a coward and an opportunist. He wouldn't risk the cold unless he had to. He had the cabin. He had won. "He's got a gun," Wyatt muttered defensively. "A .38 revolver. He kept it when the truck crashed. If you try to bust down that door, he'll shoot you through the wood." Beatrice absorbed this information. A physical breach of the cabin door was impossible anyway. It was solid steel, built to withstand a fire. But she didn't need to break down the door. She needed Caleb to open it. She looked at the tunnel trapdoor. It was an artery connecting the 2 structures. Arteries carried blood, but they also carried air. And sound. "Arthur Pendleton," Beatrice murmured to herself, a grim smile touching her lips. "You paranoid, beautiful old fool." When Arthur had designed the tunnel, he had insisted on a passive ventilation system. "You bury a pipe that big, B, you're going to get stagnant air. Mold. Maybe radon buildup," he had warned. He had installed a 6-inch PVC vent pipe that ran parallel to the main tunnel, connecting the barn's feed room directly to the cabin's cellar, allowing a slow exchange of air. Beatrice walked over to the corner of the feed room, behind the grain bins. There, protruding from the floorboards, was the open end of the 6-inch PVC pipe, covered only by a wire mesh grate. She removed the grate. She leaned down and placed her ear against the plastic rim. The acoustics of the PVC pipe were even more concentrated than the main tunnel. She could hear the faint, low hum of her diesel generator vibrating through the earth. But more importantly, she could hear the muffled sounds from inside her cellar. A heavy footstep, the squeak of the wooden stairs. Caleb was moving around above the tunnel door. Beatrice looked back at Wyatt, who was watching her with confused, pain-filled eyes. "Your brother thinks he's safe," Beatrice said quietly, lifting a heavy plastic jug of diesel fuel she kept in the barn for the tractor. "But he forgot one fundamental rule of living in the mountains, Wyatt." "What's that?" Wyatt rasped, his teeth chattering. Beatrice unscrewed the cap of the diesel jug. The sharp, chemical fumes spilled into the freezing air. She picked up an empty metal coffee can she used for scooping grain. "You never back an animal into a corner," Beatrice said, her eyes flinty and hard. "Especially an animal that knows the terrain better than you do." She walked over to the open PVC vent. She poured a generous measure of diesel fuel into the metal coffee can. She wasn't going to burn her house down. That would be suicide. But she was going to use the tunnel's airflow to her advantage. She pulled a book of matches from her pocket, always kept handy for lighting the barn's kerosene lanterns. She grabbed a handful of damp, moldy hay from the bottom of a bale, the kind that wouldn't burn clean, but would smolder and produce thick, acrid, choking smoke. She stuffed the damp hay into the coffee can, soaking it in the diesel fuel. "What are you doing?" Wyatt demanded, a new kind of panic rising in his voice. "You're going to choke us out in here." "Not us, Wyatt," Beatrice said calmly. She struck a match. The flame flared blue and yellow in the dim light. The airflow in this vent moves from the cold barn to the warmer cellar. Physics. She dropped the match into the coffee can. The diesel-soaked hay ignited instantly. Not with a bright flame, but with a dense, violent explosion of thick, black, noxious smoke. It smelled of burning tires and rotting vegetation. Beatrice quickly shoved the smoking coffee can deep down into the 6-inch PVC vent pipe. She then grabbed a heavy burlap sack and jammed it over the barnside opening, forcing the massive plume of black smoke to travel in only one direction. Straight down the pipe, across the 150-foot gap, and directly into the enclosed, unventilated cellar of her cabin, right beneath the floorboards where Caleb Dixon was making himself at home. "Now," Beatrice said, picking up the heavy iron spud bar once again and turning toward the trapdoor leading back down into the dark tunnel. "We wait for him to start coughing." The descent back into the subterranean passage was a plunge into an icy abyss. Beatrice pulled the heavy wooden trapdoor shut above her, sealing out the muted gray light of the barn, and was once again enveloped in absolute, suffocating blackness. She clicked on the mag light. Its heavy beam sliced through the freezing air, illuminating the long, ribbed steel corridor that stretched toward her home. She began the 150-foot walk, the iron spud bar resting heavily on her right shoulder. The adrenaline that had fueled her attack on Wyatt was beginning to ebb, replaced by a deep, bone-rattling chill. The temperature in the tunnel was dropping rapidly now that the heavy earth above was completely frozen and the shop lights were dead. Her breath formed thick, rapidly dissipating clouds in the beam of the flashlight. She reached the heavy steel cellar door at the cabin end of the tunnel. She clicked off the mag light, plunging herself back into darkness to preserve her night vision and her tactical advantage. She pressed her ear against the cold, flat steel of the door. For the first 5 minutes, there was nothing but the low, distant vibration of the diesel generator outside the cabin walls. The silence in the tunnel was heavy, expectant, and nerve-wracking. Beatrice stood perfectly still in the pitch black, her hands gripping the frost-slicked iron of the digging bar. Then, she heard it, a muffled, ragged cough from the other side of the steel. Then another, the 6-inch PVC ventilation pipe, emerged from the foundation wall directly above her workbench in the cellar. Beatrice envisioned the dense, oily, noxious black smoke pouring from the open pipe, cascading down the concrete walls, and rapidly filling the unventilated basement. Because Caleb had locked the heavy steel door to the tunnel, and likely closed the door at the top of the cellar stairs to keep the cabin's heat upstairs, he had unwittingly trapped himself in a perfectly sealed box. "What the hell?" A voice coughed violently. It was Caleb. The sound vibrated through the steel door, muffled but distinct. Beatrice smiled grimly in the dark. The trap was working. Caleb's reaction was predictable, driven by the primal panic of a man deprived of oxygen. The smoke from the diesel-soaked hay was incredibly acrid. It burned the eyes, scorched the throat, and triggered an involuntary gag reflex. Caleb wouldn't assume he was under attack. He would assume the heavy diesel generator, which was wired to the home's primary panel just outside the cellar wall, had suffered a catastrophic exhaust leak and was pumping carbon monoxide and smoke directly into the basement. "Wyatt!" Caleb yelled, his voice cracking into a violent fit of hacking coughs. He was stumbling around the cellar now. Beatrice could hear the heavy thud of his boots, kicking over a stack of empty mason jars, the glass shattering sharply against the concrete floor. "Wyatt, the Jenny's blown. It's filling the house." Beatrice adjusted her grip on the iron bar. She stepped to the left of the doorframe, pressing her back flat against the corrugated steel wall of the tunnel, completely disappearing into the blind spot. "Wyatt, open the damn door!" Caleb screamed, his voice strained and panicked. He was at the door now. Beatrice heard the heavy, metallic clatter of the interior deadbolt being violently thrown back. The heavy steel door groaned on its hinges and swung outward into the tunnel. A shaft of pale, gray light from the cellar's small, snow-blocked egress window spilled into the pitch-black pipe, cutting a sharp rectangle through the darkness. The air that rushed out of the cellar was thick, gray, and smelled foully of burning diesel and rotting earth. Silhouetted in the doorway was Caleb Dixon. He was taller than Wyatt, broader in the shoulders, with a thick canvas jacket and a red bandana pulled up over his nose and mouth to filter the smoke. In his right hand, gripped tightly and trembling slightly, was a snub-nosed .38 special revolver. Caleb peered into the cavernous, lightless tunnel, his eyes watering profusely from the smoke. "Wyatt?" he choked out, stepping over the threshold. He never saw her in the shadows. Beatrice didn't swing for his head. She wasn't a killer by nature, and a lethal blow in the dark was too risky. Instead, she pivoted on her heel, using the momentum of her entire body, and swung the 30-pound iron spud bar in a low, vicious arc aimed directly at Caleb's right arm. The heavy chisel tip struck his forearm with the sickening sound of snapping bone. Caleb let out a roaring, guttural scream, a sound of pure shock and agony. His fingers spasmed open, and the .38 revolver fell. But as the gun dropped, Caleb's fingers seized on the trigger. Bang! In the open air, a .38 caliber gunshot is loud. Inside, a 150-foot, 8-foot diameter corrugated steel pipe. It was an apocalyptic event. The concussive blast of the gunshot was instantly magnified 100 times, bouncing off the ribbed steel walls, creating a physical shockwave of sound that felt like a hammer blow to the skull. The muzzle flash strobed brilliantly in the smoke-filled darkness, casting a blinding, demonic split-second glare over Caleb's agonized face. Beatrice's vision went white, and a high-pitched, agonizing ring severed her hearing completely. She stumbled backward, dropping the heavy iron bar, clutching her ears as the deafening echo of the gunshot rolled back and forth down the tunnel like a trapped thunderclap. The bullet, fired blindly toward the floor, ricocheted off the poured concrete. It zipped upwards with a metallic shriek, tearing cleanly through the heavy PVC conduit mounted to the ceiling, the main electrical feed running from the cabin to the barn, before biting deep into the heavy asphalt-coated steel of the tunnel roof. Sparks rained down in a blinding cascade, a fiery waterfall of short-circuiting electricity. The severed high-voltage cables thrashed violently against the steel ceiling like glowing orange snakes, hissing and popping, filling the air with the sharp, toxic stench of ozone and melting rubber. Caleb, despite his shattered arm, was fueled by blind, terrified rage. Deafened and disoriented by the blast and the sparks, he lunged forward into the dark, tackling Beatrice around the waist. They went down hard onto the freezing concrete. The air was knocked from Beatrice's lungs in a violent rush. Caleb's sheer weight pinned her to the floor. He raised his good left hand, balling it into a fist, preparing to rain blows down on her face. Beatrice couldn't hear him screaming, but she could feel the vibration of his roars in his chest. She was 58 years old, fighting a desperate man in his 30s, in the pitch black of a subterranean grave. But as she looked up at his shadowed face, illuminated only by the dying shower of electrical sparks from the ceiling. She didn't see Caleb Dixon. She saw the brutal, unforgiving winter that had stolen Thomas. She saw the storm that was trying to bury her. She reached out with her right hand, her fingers scrambling over the freezing concrete floor. She felt the heavy, knurled aluminum barrel of the maglite she had dropped. As Caleb swung his left fist down, Beatrice brought the 3-pound flashlight up with everything she had, smashing the heavy metal end cap directly into Caleb's jaw. The impact snapped his head back. He went rigid for a terrifying second, his eyes rolling back in his head, before he collapsed entirely, his heavy body going limp across her chest. Beatrice shoved him off with a desperate, ragged heave. She rolled onto her hands and knees, gasping for breath, the metallic taste of blood in her mouth. The ringing in her ears was beginning to subside into a dull, throbbing roar. The shower of sparks from the ceiling had died, leaving the tunnel lit only by the smoky, gray rectangle of the open cellar door. She grabbed the maglite, her hands shaking violently, and clicked the button. The beam pierced the smoke, illuminating Caleb's unconscious form. His jaw was swelling rapidly, and his right arm lay at a grotesque angle. Beatrice dragged herself to her feet, leaning heavily against the curved steel wall for support. Her entire body ached, a deep, pervasive throbbing that matched the rhythm of her racing heart. She stepped carefully over Caleb's body and retrieved his dropped revolver from the floor, tucking it into the waistband of her jeans. She had won. The tunnel was hers again, but as the adrenaline finally cleared, the beam of her flashlight swept across the floor just inside the cellar doorway, revealing something that made her blood run colder than the winter air. The smoke in the cellar was beginning to thin, drawn out into the larger expanse of the tunnel. Beatrice coughed, pulling her sweater up over her nose, and dragged Caleb's heavy, unconscious body by his coat collar over the threshold and onto the basement floor. She bound his wrists with a heavy extension cord from her workbench, looping it tight enough to cut off the circulation, then secured his ankles. She propped him against the concrete foundation wall, directly beneath the still-open PVC vent pipe, which was now just blowing cold, clean air from the barn. As she worked, she noticed a heavy, black canvas duffel bag sitting on her workbench, right next to where Caleb had apparently been sitting when the smoke started. It wasn't full of canned food from her pantry. It was heavy, rectangular, and meticulously packed. Beatrice unzipped the duffel bag. Inside, beneath a few spare boxes of .38 ammunition and a hunting knife, were thick manila folders. Beatrice pulled them out and flipped them open, under the beam of her flashlight. Her breath caught in her throat. They were photographs. Dozens of them, taken from the tree line at the edge of her property. There were pictures of her cabin, pictures of the barn, and pictures of her feeding the sheep in the late summer. But most disturbingly, there were wide-angle shots of Arthur Pendleton's massive yellow excavator digging the trench. There were close-ups of the corrugated steel pipes being lowered into the earth. Beneath the photos was a folded piece of heavy architectural vellum. Beatrice unfolded it. It was a copy of the blueprints for the tunnel. In the bottom right corner, stamped in red ink, was the logo of Pendleton Excavation and Grading. Written in blue ink across the top of the vellum, in handwriting she didn't recognize, were the words, "Widow Gallagher, $80K loan, paid $45K to Arthur. The rest is in the house. Access via barn trapdoor." Beatrice stared at the paper, the reality of the situation clicking into place with the cold precision of a bank vault locking. Caleb and Wyatt hadn't just crashed their truck in the storm and stumbled upon her property by sheer, desperate chance. They had been waiting for the storm. The blizzard wasn't an obstacle to them. It was their cover. They knew she had remortgaged the property to build the tunnel. Arthur had quoted her $80,000, but she had negotiated him down to $45,000, paying him in staggered cash installments because Arthur famously hated the IRS. She had kept the remaining $35,000 in a heavy fireproof safe bolted to the floor of her bedroom closet, an emergency fund to keep the farm running in case the winters grew too harsh. Someone on Arthur's crew, likely Wyatt, who had been fired halfway through the job, had seen the blueprints, known about the hidden tunnel, and figured out the math of the loan. Wyatt had brought his brother back to finish the job under the impenetrable cover of the storm of the decade. They had planned to use the tunnel to bypass her heavy security doors, raid the safe, and leave her for dead, knowing the police couldn't reach the property for a week. A low groan broke the silence. Caleb's head lolled to the side. He blinked his eyes open, wincing as the pale light from the flashlight hit his pupils. He looked at his broken arm, then up at Beatrice, who was standing over him, holding the blueprints in one hand and his loaded .38 revolver in the other. "You didn't come here for shelter, Caleb," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm, deadpan register. "You came here to rob a widow in a blizzard." Caleb spat a mouthful of blood onto the concrete. "Wyatt talked too much when he drank," he muttered, his jaw visibly distorted from the blow of the flashlight. "Told me about the crazy old bat burying herself alive. Figured you wouldn't need the cash where you were going." Beatrice stepped forward. The barrel of the revolver pointed squarely at Caleb's chest. The English teacher was gone. The grieving widow was gone. The woman standing in the freezing, smoke-stained cellar was a creature forged by the Bitterroot winter, ruthless, cold, and entirely unyielding. "Where is the truck?" Beatrice demanded. Caleb laughed, a harsh, barking sound that ended in a groan of pain. "I told you. It's in the Clark Fork riverbed, 4 miles away, buried under 6 feet of snow by now. We're all stuck here, B. You, me, and my idiot brother. And the storm ain't breaking for another 3 days." "That's where you're wrong, Caleb," Beatrice said quietly. She turned and looked back into the pitch-black maw of the 150-foot tunnel. The severed electrical conduit hung from the ceiling, dead and useless. The tunnel was rapidly plunging into sub-zero temperatures, acting as a massive heat sink, drawing the freezing air from the unheated barn directly into her home. "We aren't stuck here together," Beatrice corrected him, her eyes fixed on the heavy steel door. "I have a house. I have a fire. I have a generator." She walked back to the steel door. She grabbed the heavy iron handle. "Wait," Caleb said, his voice hitching with sudden, genuine panic as he realized what she was doing. "Wait. You can't leave Wyatt out there. His knee is crushed. He'll freeze to death in that barn." "Wyatt made his choice when he broke into my sanctuary," Beatrice said, not looking back. "And you made yours when you locked me in the dark. You lock this door, we'll die of hypothermia." Caleb screamed, struggling uselessly against the thick extension cords binding his wrists and ankles. "The cellar isn't heated. It's going to drop below freezing in an hour." "Then I suggest you think warm thoughts, Mr. Dixon," Beatrice said. She pulled the heavy steel door shut. The loud, metallic clang echoed through the basement. She threw the heavy interior deadbolt, locking Caleb in the cold, uninsulated cellar and isolating the tunnel and Wyatt completely from the warmth of her home. Beatrice walked up the wooden stairs, unlocked the door at the landing, and stepped into her kitchen. The air upstairs was blissfully warm, smelling of wood smoke and old pine. The standby generator hummed reassuringly outside the window. She walked to the living room, checked the fire in the wood stove, and sat down in Thomas's old leather armchair. She placed the .38 revolver on the side table next to her cooling cup of coffee. Outside, the wind howled, hurling violently against the frosted glass of the windows, trying desperately to get in. But Beatrice Gallagher wasn't afraid of the winter anymore. She had looked into the dark, frozen belly of the earth, and she had proven to herself and to the ghosts that haunted her that she was the most dangerous thing in the valley. For the next 48 hours, the Bitterroot Valley remained locked in the suffocating grip of the historic blizzard. Inside the main cabin, Beatrice Gallagher sat in Thomas's leather armchair, a steady fire crackling in the cast-iron stove, reading a dog-eared copy of Moby Dick. The irony of a story about a relentless, destructive obsession was not lost on her. Outside, the wind shrieked, but inside, the rhythmic, throbbing hum of the diesel generator was the only sound that mattered. It was the heartbeat of her survival. But Beatrice was a retired high school English teacher, not an executioner. She understood the profound difference between self-defense and murder. Leaving Caleb and Wyatt to freeze to death over 3 days would cross a line that Thomas would never have forgiven. She needed them alive, not out of compassion, but out of a fierce, unyielding demand for justice. They needed to answer to Sheriff Boyd Higgins, and she needed to watch them do it. On the morning of the 8th day of the storm, the temperature outside hit 22 below zero. The unheated cellar, separated from the cabin's warmth by the thick floorboards and the locked steel door, was hovering dangerously close to the freezing point. Beatrice prepared a large thermos of boiling beef broth, gathered 2 heavy, sub-zero sleeping bags she kept for hunting season, and tucked the .38 revolver securely into her waistband. She unlocked the kitchen door and descended the wooden stairs into the dim, freezing basement. Caleb Dixon was curled into a tight, trembling ball against the concrete foundation. His lips were tinged with a terrifying shade of pale blue, and his breath hitched in shallow, rattling gasps. The frost had literally begun to climb the interior walls of the cellar, coating the concrete in a thin, sparkling layer of rime ice. He didn't look up when she approached. He was past the point of anger, bordering on the lethargic edge of severe hypothermia. "I am not a killer, Caleb," Beatrice said, her voice echoing coldly off the frosted walls. She tossed one of the heavy, insulated sleeping bags directly onto his chest. "Get inside that. Your hands are tied, so you'll have to wiggle like a worm. If you don't, your heart will stop by midnight." Caleb groaned, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at the sleeping bag, then up at her with a look of defeated, pathetic gratitude. He didn't speak as he began the agonizingly slow process of inching his bound body into the thermal material. Beatrice didn't wait to watch him finish. She unbolted the heavy steel door to the tunnel and stepped inside. The 150-foot subterranean pipe had transformed. Without the ambient heat from the dead shop lights and the continuous draw of frigid air from the barn, the tunnel had become a horizontal meat locker. The moisture from the soil outside had frozen, causing the corrugated steel walls to groan and pop loudly as the metal contracted. Her flashlight beam revealed thousands of tiny, glittering ice crystals clinging to the ceiling where the electrical conduit hung completely dead. She walked the echoing distance to the barn, her boots crunching on the frozen concrete. When she pushed open the trapdoor, the smell of the barn hit her a mix of cold lanolin, damp hay, and the sharp, coppered tang of blood. The 30 Icelandic sheep were huddled together for warmth in the center pen, their thick wool coats steaming slightly in the frigid air. Wyatt Dixon was in far worse shape than his brother. He was still tethered to the support beam, his shattered left knee swollen to the size of a grapefruit against his denim jeans. He was shivering so violently that his teeth were audibly clicking together, a rapid, castanet-like rhythm of impending death. Beatrice knelt just out of his reach. She unscrewed the cup of the thermos and poured the steaming beef broth. "Drink," she commanded, holding the cup to his cracked lips. Wyatt swallowed greedily, choking slightly as the scalding liquid hit the back of his throat. He let out a long, ragged sob as the warmth hit his stomach. Beatrice untied his arms just long enough to wrap the second sub-zero sleeping bag tightly around his shoulders, then swiftly secured his wrists again. "Why? Why are you keeping us alive?" Wyatt wheezed, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "We were going to take everything." "Because you are going to prison," Beatrice stated plainly. "And before you do, you are going to tell me exactly how Arthur Pendleton fits into this. A contractor doesn't just leave blueprints lying around for a drifter to find." Wyatt let out a dry, hacking laugh that quickly turned into a cough. Arthur is a dead man walking, B. He didn't leave those blueprints out. He practically shoved them in my face before he fired me." Beatrice frowned, the beam of the maglite illuminating the swirling dust in the freezing barn. "Explain. Your $80,000 tunnel," Wyatt rasped, leaning his head back against the wooden post. "Arthur owes 50 grand to a methamphetamine distributor up in Missoula. A bad guy. The kind of guy who breaks kneecaps with aluminum bats. Arthur took your cash, but he didn't pay his crew, and he didn't pay his suppliers. He pocketed the advance to keep his legs from getting broken. When he realized he was going bankrupt to finish your pipe, he fired me. But before he did, he showed me the vellum prints, pointed right to the note about the cash in your safe. Told me it was a damn shame a wealthy widow was living out here, all alone in the winter with that much paper money just sitting in a closet. The betrayal stung worse than the freezing air. Arthur, the man Thomas had trusted, the man who had sat at her kitchen table drinking her iced tea, had orchestrated a home invasion to cover his own illicit debts. He had used her grief to fund his salvation, and then painted a target on her back to tie up the loose ends. "Arthur thought I'd take the bait," Wyatt whispered, his eyes closing. "Thought I'd do his dirty work, take the cash, and vanish. No loose ends for him. He gets paid, you get robbed, and the cops blame the transient worker." "I see," Beatrice said. Her voice was devoid of emotion, but inside, a cold, calculated fury settled over her. She stood up, screwing the cap back onto the empty thermos. "Try not to freeze, Wyatt. The sheriff will want a full statement." On the morning of the 10th day, the wind finally died. The sudden, absolute silence that fell over the Bitterroot Valley was deafening. The sky cleared, revealing a brilliant, blinding expanse of cerulean blue against the pristine, unbroken white of the snow-buried landscape. The snowdrifts reached the eaves of the cabin's roof. At noon, the distinct, mechanical growl of a heavy-duty diesel engine shattered the quiet. Beatrice stepped out onto her front porch, wrapped in her heavy parka. Cresting the massive snowbank at the end of her quarter-mile driveway was a bright orange, tracked Tucker snowcat, its exhaust pipe puffing black smoke into the crisp air. The county seal was emblazoned on the door. Sheriff Boyd Higgins cut the engine and climbed out of the heated cab. He waded through waist-deep snow, up to the porch, his face ruddy from the cold, a look of profound relief washing over his weathered features. "B," Boyd shouted, pulling off his heavy gloves. "Thank God Almighty. The radio towers have been down for 6 days. Half the county is frozen solid. I thought for sure." He trailed off, looking at the smoke casually drifting from her chimney. "You look like you just woke up from a nap." "I had a busy week, Boyd," Beatrice said calmly. She reached into her parka pocket and pulled out the .38 revolver, holding it safely by the barrel, and handed it to the stunned sheriff. Boyd stared at the gun, then up at Beatrice. "B, whose is this?" "It belongs to a man named Caleb Dixon. He's currently wrapped in a sleeping bag in my cellar with a broken arm," Beatrice said smoothly. "His brother, Wyatt, is in the barn. Shattered patella. They broke in during the whiteout. They came for the cash in my safe." Sheriff Higgins stood frozen on the steps, his jaw slightly slack. You have 2 armed home invaders captured on your property?" "Yes," Beatrice nodded. She reached into her other pocket and pulled out the folded architectural vellum. "And I have the blueprints that Arthur Pendleton gave them to facilitate the robbery. I expect Arthur will be joining them in a cell shortly." Boyd Higgins took the vellum, looking from the blueprints, to the gun, to the slight, 58-year-old woman standing on the porch. He slowly shook his head, a mixture of awe and mild terror in his eyes. "B. Gallagher," Boyd muttered, securing the revolver in his heavy winter coat. "Remind me to never, ever cross you." "Just get them out of my house, Boyd," Beatrice said, turning back toward the heavy oak door of her cabin. "I have sheep to feed." The trial was swift and unsparing. Wyatt and Caleb Dixon both pleaded guilty to armed robbery and aggravated burglary, securing 10-year sentences in the state penitentiary. Their testimonies, combined with the annotated blueprints, were enough to ensure Arthur Pendleton's conviction for conspiracy and fraud. Arthur's excavation business was liquidated to pay off his debts and the hefty fines imposed by the county. As for Beatrice Gallagher, the county ultimately discovered her unpermitted subterranean structure during the investigation. However, recognizing the extraordinary circumstances of her survival, a sympathetic judge waived the commercial fines, ordering only a retroactive inspection to ensure structural integrity. The tunnel passed flawlessly. Beatrice kept her underground bridge. It was no longer a monument to her husband's tragic death, nor a dark reminder of the siege she had endured. It became a permanent, echoing testament to a woman who refused to let the unforgiving Montana winter or the greed of desperate men bury her alive.